So what I'm going to be talking about is internet broadband and spectrum policy, and why those things obviously overlap, but why it's important to distinguish between them. So I'm not going to talk about spectrum policy, but I spent a lot of time writing about all three of these topics. So when you think about what is the internet, well, most people think of it as the platform for our communications, access to content, information, and e-commerce. And to get access to all of those wonderful things that keep improving and expanding, we obviously have to have broadband for the internet access. And increasingly, broadband means mobile broadband. And to get mobile broadband, you need to have spectrum, radio frequency spectrum allocated. And the future we're trying to build there is commonly talked about as being 5G. So this, fifth generation vision of mobile broadband services. And that vision of mobile broadband services is broadband access everywhere, broadband access in dense areas, a lot higher user mobility, a whole bunch more capability. So like smartphones on turbocharging, right? But to do that, obviously we need more spectrum. So there's a spectrum management question. We need mobile broadband everywhere because it's increasingly regarded as essential infrastructure. So that's a universal access challenge. And we want more trusted internet access, or we want more online. So it's not really sure what more online might mean, but that's basically about connectivity and security. What's the problem with that? Well, the first problem is that the 5G vision is about a lot more than just enhanced mobile broadband services. So the rest of that slide that I obscured before, talked about this ultra reliable communications or massive Internet of Things that will obviously both enhance the mobile broadband experience, but add a lot of other stuff. The other problem is it's not just a cellular vision. The next generation wireless vision is about a bunch of other stuff. And so if you see down here at the bottom, you see, for example, enhanced hotspot, that's shorthand for Wi-Fi. You see autonomous vehicle mobility and a lot of other stuff. So the next generation vision is about a lot more than that. So also we talk about the spectrum, and it's used for mobile broadband. It's also about a lot of other things, not just broadband. It's also about sensing. And we talk about mobile broadband for internet access. It's important to understand that our broadband connections are used to get us a lot of stuff that is not internet related. It's not internet traffic. And then when we talk about access online, again, a lot of that is not just internet. From spectrum perspective, sensing is obviously critically important for essential situational awareness, for automation, for medical, for basic science, so radio astronomy, and often that spectrum access is passive, but the requirements of all these different sort of wireless uses are very difficult to sort out. There's a lot of technology in there that is very different from the kinds of issues that you confront when you talk about something like making a mobile broadband service accessible. When you talk about mobile broadband, it's important to understand that it's about more than just mobile network operators. Edge user networks are going to be incredibly important, already are. Most of the traffic that comes from your smartphones already traveling on Wi-Fi networks. So home, enterprise, and municipal networks in the future of whatever next generation wireless are going to play a much bigger role with a lot more intelligence distributed to the edges. And we talk about internet access online. First, we should be clear that the internet should not just be about entertainment, but more importantly about smart X, which is replace the X with energy grid, supply chains, healthcare, factories, or anything else. And all of that stuff is necessary if we're going to see the future of Internet of Things, AI, autonomous vehicles, etc. The other really important thing is that most of what people are doing, and when they go to the internet, is not internets per se, but it's via the digital platforms. And most of that traffic's not on the internet. I've written earlier papers sort of talking about, we don't want to build necessarily an internet that's designed just for entertainment, because the requirements of an entertainment oriented internet are different than what you might want for Smart X. That's an earlier paper. Another paper was a paper about the fact that in understanding the internet architecture, and this is joint work with David Clark, it's an ecosystem of layered platforms, that the design of the internet and the model of like an edge user connecting with IP across this thing, and it's all internet, all end to end, and, through this hierarchy of tier one service providers, that's not what the internet looks like. It hasn't looked that way since 2005. Actually, the internet is layered on top of a bunch of other infrastructure platforms. And the dominant players in that ecosystem are operating complex ecosystems of platforms, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook. Again, that's another paper. So what does this mean for policy? Well, yes, obviously spectrum, internet, and broadband policy overlap and interdependent. We need all three of them. They need to be coordinated. They're aspects that feed back into each other, but it's also important to keep them clear. So what are the policy domains? Well, competition policy, industrial policy, jurisdiction, who's responsible, what agency, and what level do you need to deal with this, and then obviously economic growth and innovation. And obviously all kinds of other stuff. We've talked about some of that stuff came up in the earlier talk. So like intellectual property, trade, privacy, fiscal policy, employment policy, and obviously as we transition to a digital economy, every domain of policy in some sense is going to have aspects that are going to overlap with spectrum, internet, and broadband stuff, which is the stuff that in its first instance is focused on providing the basic infrastructure. And another point I want to make is that the digital platforms are an interface between that digital infrastructure, which is where I spend most of my time thinking, and the real economy. So when we think about competition policy, I think the biggest challenge there will be talking about what do we do with the digital platforms and how do we think about them. And I think that's already been well identified within the policy community. And we talk about industrial policy in this space. I think the key question is, what is the right broadband infrastructure that we need to make universally accessible to our citizens in our various countries? And that is a debate that I think it needs to be clarified. There's a lot more that can be done in that space. When we talk about jurisdiction, I think we need to be really clear as to what are policy domains that are inherently national or local versus what are ones that are inherently international. And the clear example of what's inherently international is the internet. The internet, if we nationalize it, and I think more of that's coming, is going to diminish greatly what the internet did. And I think we'll have to live with that, and how we live with that is going to be an interesting challenge. And of course, all of these things, the idea there is we're trying to promote more economic growth and innovation. And what we want to do there is we want to enable flexible value chains as policymakers or regulators, which is sort of the perspective I'm taking. In other words, we don't believe that the policymakers, the regulators, know what the right technology or business models are, or necessarily what consumer values are most important. And so, we're trying to basically provide scope and guidance to let markets where they can work deal with that, but we can't work everywhere. So what about competition policy, industrial policy, and jurisdiction? Well, competition policy today is mostly about antitrust, and it's historically been relatively reactive. The idea is you want to enable markets, but not necessarily a particular industry structure. So for example, monopoly power is not inherently a problem, but the abuse of monopoly power is. Now we're seeing this emergence as sort of the new antitrust, and that's a really complicated debate that a number of the folks on this in this workshop, including people like Christopher Yu, have made really important contributions to. And it raised these questions about, our digital platforms fundamentally different? That's something I'm happy to talk about. It's, but it's something I think we need to keep clear when we think about the infrastructure policy. From the industrial policy, it's the key thing is universal mobile broadband, which, what should that look like? How to make it available to everybody? What makes sense for that? And in doing that, I think we have to be clear that it's not just 5G as defined by the mobile network operators. And if the mobile network operators have everything they need, that we will have the right future of wireless. That's not what I think is going to happen. I think a lot more of it's going to be depend on the deployment and the management of networks at the edges. So municipal networks, community networks, home networks, enterprise networks, and technologies like Wi-Fi and the next generations of that are going to be very much part of that, plus a lot of other technologies like satellite broadband and a lot of other stuff, PANs, WANs. It's a very complicated technical space of what the right wireless is. From jurisdiction, one of the big challenges is going to be sort of federal FCC guidance, and how do you reconcile the FCC versus other agencies like in the US, the National Telecommunications Information Agency's role in this space. How do you reconcile that with local zoning, since so much of the investment to build the next generation of infrastructure is going to be more like real estate? And as David Clark said a long time ago to me, was if it's like real estate, it would be nice if it could move and be treated economically and regulatory like real estate. Whereas if it moves at a different pace, it ought to be regulated differently. So I think there's going to be a fundamental challenge of how we separate active and passive aspects of the network and make both of those open or shared in the appropriate kind of way. From broadband and spectrum policy, both of those are mostly national, but spectrum obviously, especially with things like satellite and coordinating to bring down equipment costs, there's certainly an international component. The internet, by its definition and nature, and I heard Andrew Sullivan, the president of ISOC, give a talk the other day. He said, by its definition, it's fundamentally a multi-stakeholder international body. I understand there will be national interest and we'll be pushing that, but we need to push back on that. From the final and sort of most important thing, if we talk about economic growth and innovation, it needs to be about Smart X, or at least Smart X has to be part of the internet we're going to build for the future. Entertainment is clearly going to be really important. We may be able to build the Smart X networks on the back of entertainment, but entertainment won't increase economic growth. It's not going to deliver the benefits that we're hoping. And if it was all just about entertainment, why would we be worrying so much about building out broadband? It's also about, like I say, enabling markets. So the policies ought to do that instead of architecting industry structure. And it should be about also managing the disruption, because as we go to the digital economy future, there are clearly going to be different sectors of the economy in different countries that are going to move at different rates. And so equity considerations are really important, and things like winner take all and excessive concentration. Markets have not been dealing with this well in recent years, and how we deal with that's going to be really important, and goes to the root of what kind of political systems we want to have. This should be my last slide. So if you think across the different boundaries and you ask yourself, well, what's spectrum? Well, it's a fundamental resource. It's renewable. In other words, if I don't use the spectrum right now, or if someone doesn't use spectrum right now, it's wasted. It could have been used. Sort of like, they talk about like water, it's like that, more like that. Broadband is a fundamental sort of infrastructure providing connectivity for a lot of things, one of which that's very important is the internet, but that's not all. Our voice services, a lot of our video entertainment services, a lot of other things don't go over the internet, but come into our house over broadband facilities and infrastructure. Whether or not they're actually part of the same IP stream or a separate IP stream is more of a technical question than it is a question of the fundamental, investment that underlies that. And the internet is about sort of connectivity and interconnection. It's the ability to sort of connect people together. The key features that are changing in spectrum, it's all about moving towards much more flexible radio access networks, which will enable us to more dynamically and on a more granular basis share the radio frequency spectrum. Historically, there's been this dichotomy in spectrum policy between the unlicensed model, sort of Wi-Fi, and this license model, sort of what the MNOs preferred. But the future is going to be blending those models and sharing much more intensively. And we're already seeing that in the 3.5 CBRS band in the US. With broadband, it's about mobile broadband. And in mobile broadband in a 5G or 6G or next generation wireless world, it's really a converged fixed mobile infrastructure from a user's perspective. It's a general purpose platform to get people to do the digital things they want to do and just have it work. And a lot more of what will happen there will be things that won't require individuals or users to be directly involved in it. It'll be content pre-pushed to your phone or whatever, so that it's easier there for you, and that all of that is designed to make your experience better. But of course, developing trust is going to be important. And we talk about the internet, it's fundamentally distributed autonomous systems. We can, the control and the ownership, the economic ownership of it is fundamentally distributed. And that's something that, we have to deal with when we talk about how to manage it. The focal policy challenges are spectral efficiency, interference protection are sort of the two most important things, and how to basically get those so that we can have a shared spectrum future where new technologies can get in and use it. We can share between government users or mission-driven users like basic science and commercial users who can pay for the spectrum access they get. That's a difficult problem. There's a lot of sort of moving parts to it, and that is inextricably tied up with radio frequency wireless technologies. From competition policy perspective, I think fundamentally we're going to be dealing with trying to figure out how to manage an oligopoly, and that does not mean that we're not going to have lots of competition. I think mobile services in most markets in the US and Europe, I think are, by most metrics, highly competitive. But we have these questions about how do we get to 5G and universal service, where is it reasonable to believe that each of those oligopolists whether it's 3 or 4 operators, can each of them justify building out a network, or do we need to share stuff? And then there's also this more and more critical infrastructure. And that's going to call for some sort of national broadband plan. You know, we had one in the US in 2010. A lot of other folks did similar plans like that. It's time to update those. Most of those plans now are called 5G plans. And I think some of those have sort of drank too much of the 5G Kool-Aid, and I think sort of miss it. And then with respect to the internet, the challenges are how do we get interconnection, interoperability, and openness, hallmarks of what made the internet so valuable as an engine for economic growth and cooperation and everything else since its birth, where a lot of the stuff is now shifted elsewhere, you know, but how do we do that? And that's really a challenge for internet governance. There's a lot of interesting questions there. As I said, the digital platforms are the intersection, they're the interface between the internet infrastructure and the real economy. And, you know, the whole question about what do we do about digital platforms, that's a whole other talk. But I think the key point here is you understand the interactions, but keep them separate. So with that, I'll